Right, hi everyone. Nice to see you once again. I feel like I'm always up here. Right, so we mentioned earlier, I work in the cross-modal research lab at Oxford University in experimental psychology. So I'm not necessarily a wine economist, but I will try my best to use the language. So at the lab, we study how the different senses interact. And actually, my PhD was focused on how music influences flavor perception. But that is not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about wine complexity. And just really quickly, you probably saw this picture already. I have a very serious interest in wine. So while I'm a psychologist, I try to do studies that involve wine. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is this idea of wine complexity. Just what we mean by wine complexity, and especially this idea of blending wines. So could one actually get more complexity if we blend wine? And also, perhaps more interesting to people in this field is, are people more willing to pay for a wine that is somehow seen as more complex? So first of all, wine complexity. What do we mean by wine complexity? Because many wine writers and wine critics like to use this word as if it's a positive trait. So for example, here's a quote from Matt Kramer of Wine Spectator. And he basically says that the more times you can return to a glass and find something else that's different in a wine, for him that is complexity. But if we try to analyze wine complexity, don't say anything about just because my partner is a chemist, so he probably finds fault in what I'm saying here, which is we can think about complexity as either existing in the wine itself or in the person who's perceiving the wine. So if you say that complexity exists in the wine itself, we can be talking about the chemical or the physical properties of the molecules that's in the wine. So what is their structural component and how many different compounds can we have in the wine? Of course, this is most of the time not what we're talking about when we're talking about wine, because wines have many hundreds and thousands of different chemicals, and they're all of different sizes and molecular complexity. So we believe, at least in psychology, that when we're talking about complexity in a wine, we're talking about what is inferred by the observer. So it can be referring to the number of flavors you pick up in a wine. There could be an element of temporal evolution, so either in the mouth, as I'm tasting, I might pick up different flavors on the attack, in the mid-palate, or on the finish. Or it could even be talking about the evolution of the wine in the glass. So when I first taste it versus when I taste it 5 minutes later or 10 minutes later, that wine could be evolving. And that could be a part of complexity. Or there's this idea of an integrated percept. So maybe I'm not able to pick out different flavors from the wine, but I get this overwhelming sense of complexity. For example, a good Chablis might have this sense of minerality and salinity. I might not be able to pick up a lot of individual flavors, but there's a sense of a coherency. And if you want to know more about complexity, Charles and I have written a review paper published in Chemical Senses about wine complexity. And further on, there's also influence of expertise. So Wendy Parr from New Zealand wrote a review paper in 2011 looking at how experts and novices perceive wine complexity. And her main finding was that, well, experts tend to think about the method of production. So when they're evaluating a wine for complexity, they're thinking about how was it made? Is there MLF? Was there oak aging? Whereas wine consumers tend to focus on the image or the brand of the bottle, and also how much they like it. So things that they like more tend to be perceived as more complex. And I'm a WSET diploma student at the moment, and we've also done WSET educator courses. So I just wanted to bring in a more industry perspective on how people are taught about complexity. In this case, you can have a complex wine if you have many flavors that are primary, so coming from the grape itself. So you can imagine a Gewürztraminer that has lychee, roses, peaches, etc. Or we also talk about this concept of secondary aromas and flavors which come from winemaking, or tertiary flavors which come from wine aging. So you can also have a complex wine if it has a mix of primary aromas from fruit and secondary aromas from winemaking, so like vanilla is the most typical example. And if it has tertiary aromas, so for example, animal, leather, tobacco kind of flavors. So the question that I wanted to address in my study was one, this blending actually increased the perception of complexity. So there are many different wine cultures. So for example, in the Douro with port, or in Champagne by making Champagne, or in Bordeaux with Bordeaux blends, there's an emphasis on blending different wines, even in the case of Champagne, across different vintages, because it's an idea that blending a wine will give you more complexity. And the second question is complexity worth paying for? And I show some wines below from New Zealand producers, because there's an initiative in New Zealand of Sauvignon Blanc producers who are trying to make wines that are more complex. Now, whether that's by organic farming or by aging the wine on lees, they're addressing a variety of different approaches to try to create wines that are more complex, because at least they believe people are willing to pay for more complexity. So very quickly, featuring Megan again, this was a collaboration with Dr. Frank, mostly because I had very strict requirements on the wines I wanted to use for my study. They all had to be from the same region, from the same vintage, but I wanted different single variety wines. And in the Finger Lakes, people like to, I guess, experiment, and Megan was very kind to donate some wines for my study. So we had Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Cabernet Franc, which are the classic Bordeaux varietals. So I had 3 single varietal wines, and then I made 3 50-50 blends from those wines. I recruited 87 people from Oxford using both the psychology participant database, which is where I got most of my beginners, and also because I run the Oxford Blind Tasting Society, I was able to use that network to recruit some of my intermediate and especially the experts. And by experts, I mean people who's completed WSET level 3 or have been coming to wine tasting for at least 5 years. And this is blind wine tasting. So this is the experimental setup. People had 6 glasses of red wines. 3 of them are single varietal, 3 of them are blended. I ran 10 different sessions. Within each session, people had randomized order of wines. So this was a Latin square to get rid of any kind of carryover effects of the wine. So people tasted the wines in different orders. In the questionnaire, for each questionnaire, they had to first list 5 flavors that most describe the wine. And these were the table of flavors that I got. These were taken from the WSET Level 3 Guide to Tasting. And I ran a pre-study to get a list of, I believe, 87 words that were used by experts to describe the wines I had. And then I asked people to evaluate on a scale of 1 to 9, liking, familiarity, complexity, and flavor intensity of the wine. And these questions were randomized across different participants. So you didn't always get liking first and didn't always get familiarity second. And then lastly, I asked people to rate the quality of the wine on a scale of 1 to 20. This is the Jancis-Robinson Purple Pages scale. And this was also the scale that was used in a prior 1962 study that I was trying to partially replicate, which is why this was 1 to 20. And I also asked people for their willingness to pay for a 750 milliliter bottle in British pounds. And I was critiqued in the last session by some wine economists because I didn't measure people's buying power. So when I analyzed willingness to pay, I also analyzed their age and gender to try to compensate for some of the willingness to pay factors. And once they evaluated all 6 wines, I had a final question, which is I asked them, which wines do you think were blends? And I will address this in a moment. So, first of all, were people actually willing to tell the blends from the single varietal wines? When we looked at everybody overall, the short answer is no. Based on their guessing patterns, there was no difference between the single varietal wines and the 50-50 blends. But when you separated people based on expertise, what I found was that the pattern of saying whether a wine was a blend or not was different for beginners and for intermediates. And in fact, it was only the experts who couldn't, by some standards, differentiate between the blends and the single varietals. So this was quite interesting. So then I looked at people's data to see, well, exactly how were people making their guesses of whether a wine was a blend or not. And it turns out that the factor that significantly influenced people's guess was this familiarity. So if they found the wine to be less familiar, they were more likely to mark that as a blend. So the next question I had was, if I have blends, even if people can't tell that it's a blend, does it actually increase perceived complexity and quality? So I did a multivariate ANOVA with blend and expertise as factors. And the short answer was actually no. Whether the wine was a 50-50 blend or whether it was a single varietal, there were no differences in terms of liking, complexity, familiarity. Very soon, but there was a significant effect of expertise level. So in short, experts compared to novices and intermediates were more likely to rate the wine as familiar, higher quality, and they were willing to pay more. So experts were on average willing to pay £12 for a bottle versus the novices, which were 8. So almost done. How do people perceive complexity? So this was my multi-variate linear regression. So the factors that could account for complexity. So we had quality, intensity, and liking, which were all orthogonal. But also age and gender had a small effect on complexity, and even the wine order. So this was interesting, which showed that complexity is not just objective. It could also be affected by people's age and gender, and even in the order of the wine tasting. So people tended to rate the wines that they tasted later as slightly more complex. And a really quick linguistic analysis just to show that which words were more associated with complexity. And these are the words that were associated with winemaking. So coconut, oak, vanilla, toast. And really, really quickly, are people willing to pay for complexity? The answer is actually no, once you control for the other factors. And what are factors that explain willingness to pay? Well, it's quality and liking, which are orthogonal. So people can actually differentiate between quality and liking. They're not the same. And also wine expertise. The more experienced you are, the more you're willing to pay for a bottle of wine, at least in my study. And again, the descriptors that accounts for willingness to pay. So again, you have these winemaking terms of vanilla, butter, and then chocolate, which has to do with ripeness, and also with oak. These were what predicted people's higher willingness to pay. So, very quickly, in summary, I'll just put all these up on the slides. So whether a wine was a 50-50 blend or not didn't really impact perceived complexity. But in general, experts are more willing to pay for wines. They also perceive the wines as higher quality. Complexity, it can be predicted by 3 different types of factors. So wine quality, intensity, and liking, which is factors that exist in the wine, but also based on people's demographic, so age and gender, and then the order of wine tasted, which shows that complexity is a very complex concept that depends both on the wine and on the person. Complexity and willingness to pay were both associated with oak flavors, and we didn't see a correlation between complexity and willingness to pay. But willingness to pay was driven by the quality, perceived quality, liking, and expertise. And that's it.